everyone. I am here. My name is Miranda Lash, Bruss Senior Curator at Museum of Contemporary Art Denver. And it's my great honor to be here today with the inimitable Jason Moran. Hi, Jason. Welcome.
How you doing, Miranda? Good to be here.
So glad to have you with us today. Today, it's my pleasure to talk with you about the exhibition, Jason Moran, Bathing the Room with the Blues, which is actually going to close soon at MCA Denver. It's been a magnificent run and really such a pleasure to have your work on view at our museum. So Jason, I thought our goal in being together today is to go through your thought process in creating these works and talk through how the exhibition evolved and developed over time. And of course, we just want to hear generally about where your head is at now. So Jason, I thought we could start by going back in time a little bit to 2020. So before you and I spoke, but when you were developing these works on paper, and talk a little bit about what it meant for you as both artist, musician, collaborator, performer, to be going out to the woods of Connecticut and making a body of works on paper.
Yeah, pianists generally work in rooms with walls because pianos are rarely outside, and that kind of limits kind of music making because the piano is not a mobile instrument. It's an instrument that either people put their drinks on or their family photos on, or it's inside of a living room or something. And so working outside is always kind of a big jump in for everything, for the imagination, for reconciling kind of concert sound with the natural sound of the planet,
Mm-hmm.
So working outside and making these works, and all of the works I've been making for the past couple of years, has been tremendous to pull the action, the action of kind of putting my hands on the keyboard, not inside of a room. And I'm working in Stamford, Connecticut at my in-laws' house, Halls. My wife is born and raised in Stamford, Connecticut, and it has always been a place not only for gathering, but also during the pandemic became a place to use as a studio outside. And so that was a big trigger moment. Also, just looking at paper, looking at the hue, looking at the squirrel that came by. And seeing what happened after that,
Yeah. So Jason, were there specific songs you had in mind as you were creating these works?
When I first started making the works in a studio, maybe 5-6 years ago, I actually was making them on the piano that I still have. And then my wife would come in to play the piano. She was like, "Wait a minute, you got to stop this." This is dangerous. She's a classical singer. Alicia is a classical singer and composer. And she was like, "Look, every time I play, there's dust kind of coming up from the keys." So
Oh my gosh.
I started working with Steinway to use old piano manuals, which is just the keyboard component of the instrument, extracting them from instruments they weren't using anymore or were replacing. And so I called Steinway and said, "Can I have a manual?" And so I used these manuals. And then I had the hammers of the manual actually they weren't hitting strings for the piano. They were actually just hitting a piece of plywood. So in the spring, it actually sounded like I was another woodpecker that was outside. So now the hammers of the keys actually hit the wood, and it sounded more like I was a roofer repairing someone's roof. And for Black music in America, it has always been about the progression of the music has been through the rhythm. Whether you listen to the swing rhythm or you listen to the R&B rhythm, the swing rhythm of the 30s, the R&B rhythm of the 50s, the funk and soul rhythms of the 60s, to the 70s, to the hip hop rhythms of the 80s and 90s. It continues to change. We mark ourselves through the rhythm. And in jazz, especially, the way rhythms and syncopation feels as kind of an uplift moment, that was kind of what was getting resonated. Now, as I play, I can always kind of hear to a degree where, because of the years and years and years of muscle memory, there also comes a tonal memory that you have with how you make an action. So even though I could make my hand go like this into the air, I still kind of hear the way that phrase sounds. So that was kind of also part of making these pieces, was also just about memory of sound too.
Yeah, well, memory of sound is a huge theme in this project, right? So there's that immediate memory of sound of what this would sound like while you were playing. And then from our conversations, it sounds though like you were thinking about it much further as far as the historical memory of sound. So there's that immediate, and then there's that layered idea of remembering songs from eras past, as you mentioned, you know, evolutions of style, evolutions of places.
And also, you know, like canon is not only in the sound, but it's also in the body movement too. And so how do we record songs, you know? So if I think of how Louis Armstrong or Billie Holiday sang a song, it's also, you know, in their breath itself, you know, like, so then how do we mark the breath other than through the microphone? And working with an artist who I've been working with for the past, I guess now 16, 17 years, Joan Jonas, she has a process within her performances that we've done together of also making work that become a kind of recording of the performance itself too. So she makes these live drawings within the performance, and they become kind of a relic, an artifact of the show. And that transfer is really important. That transfer has always been important in America. How do we transfer to the land? How do we transfer to each other, songs to each other, food to one another, love to one another, all of that. And so how do we mark the physicality of making music? You know, just the pressure of the fingers onto the key. And I think also specifically of the way a great pianist, Cecil Taylor, really attacks the keyboard, you know, with his body, because he's also a dancer too. But he really attacks it. So, oh, what I wish I could have the moment to place some paper and pigment under his hands to record him that way, you know.
I mean, I love that you impress upon us that it's such a physical practice. And there was this wonderful moment when we were in the archives of the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library, and we'll talk about that in a second. But basically, when an archivist asked you, "What do you mean by the residues of music making?" And you had this very physical reply to that question, where you talked about. Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's the footprint, it's the fingerprint, it's the trace, you know. You know, if you came in and robbed, robbed a grocery store, then they would look for fingerprints on the door handle, you know, to trace you. So, but in music making, say John Coltrane's saxophone, he also plays he also uses a bit of wood to put into his mouthpiece. That piece of wood that he throws away, he discards it at the end of a show. But that is a treasure. That is the piece of wood that he bites on to actually get the sound and blows wind against, to create resistance, to get this tone, this beautiful tone that we all listen to. But that piece of wood is really important to that process, as is the horn itself, you know. So it's all these kind of components of it in a life in music. You know, you end up noticing how much kind of gets discarded. And the sound or the recording kind of becomes the thing that we treasure the most. And I kind of argue that there are other components that we should treasure, whether it's the room, the venue that we're in, whether it's the instrument, whether it's the people, you know, what are the other components that make for a brilliant piece of music? And let's start gathering those together too.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And I want us to go further into what are all the pieces of a musical experience, because I think in the end game seems to be to bring more people into this appreciation by activating all the senses, you know, not just pulling on it being strictly oral. So going to the next slide, this is the piano that you were talking about, where you were playing and listening to the rhythm. Really, it was more the rhythm that
it
was
is. Yeah, and you know, and that one is now destroyed. I had to get a new manual just about a few months ago to make some new works, because that one just really fell apart over time. But yeah, it's about rhythm, you know. And so you can kind of see at the top of the keyboard manual, there's a row of hammers, and the hammers are what strikes the string that kind of makes the sound of the piano. but all those parts. But looking at a manual, just even, without its kind of body, just we're kind of looking at the teeth of a
Right.
piano
Yeah.
right now.
Yeah. Mhm. And it should be acknowledged, you had a very successful show in New York of these works on paper that you created at Luring Augustine, The Sound Will Tell You. And I felt seeing those works was in a way a great prelude to our conversations together about what would appear at MCA Denver.
Mhm.
So now we're looking at an example of one of those works, We Are Songs in a Room. And
Mhm.
even the title itself has an embodied feel to it, right? We are songs in a room. It's not
Mhm.
just about the strictly oral experience. But since this is, I should say on the exterior of the MCA, we have this artwork on the vinyl, almost as if the fans of the building are like keys.
Mhm.
Um, could you talk a little bit about this work specifically and on the process of making it?
Yeah, there's a break in the middle of the piece, and that is where the center of my body is. I mean, you can kind of see this part where the hands will, this piece is made by moving the hands in opposition to one another. Uh, and that break is where always I situate my body at the piano itself. And and if I'm really sitting in front of the piano, it's like my navel is just to the left of middle C. I favor the left hand. That means I favor the lower part of the keyboard that I think resonates and gives the earth a sound rather than the air in the right hand.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
this work kind of is also just a mapping of where my body is just at the piano itself. Um, Now, one thing that I think some of this one, as opposed to some of the others, kind of brings to is generally because the piano is such a big part of my life. I generally always think of the keyboard as singular, and just start beginning to think about it as multiplicity.
Mhm.
You know that changes a lot of the feeling on it. But also, it's a gathering itself. I mean, when you look at especially how the black keys are resonating or how the black keys are kind of figuring themselves on the paper.
Mhm.
So this one kind of just is the map of where I am, but also the map of when they start to gather together. There's something that happens with the piano where, if anybody has a piano at home and they went to the piano after this talk, and placed their hands at the very bottom on the left side,
Mhm. Mhm.
those bottom notes, they rarely get to talk to each other in
Mhm.
contemporary music. They're
Mhm.
often kind of relegated to just one note at a time. But I think that there's something that happens when you really get an aggregate of voices all together, and it
Mhm.
kind of charges the space in a way that you have to listen a little bit harder to hear what do
Mhm.
these voices want to say to each other. So this is
Mhm.
also a mapping of that kind of conversation too.
Yeah. Well, and there's a song that you chose for the Three Deuces at MCA Denver that has this intense working of the low notes,
Mm.
almost like rolling thunder. I remember you said it was in a way it calls your attention, right? That there's this intense working of the low notes because it's not
Mhm.
something we're used to seeing.
Yeah, and hearing and the piano is a instrument that can do a lot of things, and that's kind of also it itself has mapped a lot of the past 300-400 years. It's kind of been marked
Mhm.
with kind of piano repertoire and or keyboard repertoire, and in that mapping is the earth itself. So how
Mhm.
is it
Mhm.
used in Germany?
Mhm.
How is it used in Sao Paulo? How is it used in South Africa? Over the years the piano continues to change, and so it itself is kind of like a computer, but it doesn't mean that we've all figured out what is possible on it yet. And I think
Mhm.
that is also the quest of myself as a musician too. But I'm trying to also at the same time trying to figure out what other kind of physical trace does it leave, as well as what kind of sonic traces it leaves.
Mhm. Absolutely. And actually, that's a great segue to Three Deuces. We always talked about having Three Deuces as part of this presentation, I think from our very first conversations. And for a lot of reasons, right? Calling out that physicality that you've been talking about and
Mhm.
acknowledging, in 2020, 2021, we were seeing yet another wave of closures of spaces. So, you've talked about closures of spaces in Harlem. In Denver, we also recently experienced the closure of El Chapultepec, which was a really very notable jazz space. So for us, even though Three Deuces had already had an illustrious track record of exhibition, from the Venice Biennale to your traveling survey exhibition, there was something about this piece's homage to the history of spaces that have been, that felt resonant to show with the works on paper. Do you want to talk about? Go ahead.
Sure. Those spaces, I mean, right now, jazz clubs, depending on what time of day you're watching this, they're mostly sitting dormant and they're waiting. The instruments are in wait, but also to another degree, the revolution is waiting, and especially for this club, the Three Deuces, which was on 52nd Street in New York City in the 1940s and 50s. And it was where Charlie Parker, Miles Davis, Max Roach, Bud Powell, where bebop really kind of continued to flower, was in this small basement with a padded wall. And so when I think about the way jazz has mapped the temperature of America, I think about this as kind of like, this is a room that though the musicians are not there, it is the space that is changing the future. It is documenting the present, but in hopes to show us how to improvise a new future. And that is important to look at for, I think, spaces where improvisational music is elevated, even if it's in a basement. So having this always be on view in front of someone to walk by and see the three instruments, the piano, the bass, the drums, sitting dormant. It's also a bit spooky too, in a good way. But it does ask the question like, oh, well, okay, Carnegie Hall is sitting dormant right now, waiting for the next act to come on stage to change people's futures. Possibly if the music is that great. Even if the music is terrible, I'm never going there again. Let's be clear. There's a lot of that too. But the Three Deuces also, is a marker of Chapultepec, is a marker of Dazzle. I remember coming and playing Dazzle in Denver when it was in a different space than it is now. And that changes, a city. When a club is one space and then it moves to another space, then it has to build almost a new shell, kind of like a snake shedding its skin, then trying to say, okay, now I have this diamond to show on my back.
I have to ask about the stool because I know I noticed that you brought the stool with you to perform at the holiday, and we'll talk about that in a second. But so each instrument has its own story in a way, but could you talk about the stool?
Well, the stool is, for any pianist, you live your life kind of showing up at instruments you don't necessarily know. And that psychologically is difficult to do. A saxophonist brings their own saxophone. A trumpeter brings his own trumpet. A bass player, if they're playing electric bass, they probably bring their own bass. A guitar player, same. A drummer brings their own sticks and their own cymbals. But a piano, you just kind of show up and the instrument is there, and you really hope for the best. And one thing that became important and is important for other pianists as well is what they sit on. And so, say there's very famous images of the great classical pianist Glenn Gould, and he used to sit on this piano chair that he had even from when he was a child. And so later in his career, that chair is totally, the fabric is all tattered. It's sitting very low. But you see him, in his home space. So, and at all times, I try to have, if I can't have my chair at the venues, then I try to have a chair that at least gives me the bit of support. And this wood stool became the one that I wanted to also shift a bit of that notion about what Three Deuces was too, because in recreating these spaces, I can't simply say, okay, here are the images that I want to, let's put the fabric up, let's put the instruments in the same place, and then, okay, we're done. But it has to have a bit of a turn. And I'm considering in having this stool there for the piano, that there's a different kind of root that we have to acknowledge, that that this is wood, that this is the fabric of America. This is the tree, this is the trunk, this music that happens in this space. And so it is I brought it to the Holiday Theater. Actually, I didn't bring it. Your staff from the MCA, they brought it. And I thought, oh, that's a great choice. I would have never thought to bring that heavy thing.
That's funny.
Thanks, Mike.
Well, speaking of turns, I think that's something that makes this exhibition special. All your exhibitions are special, but I actually love the care that you put into making, into responding to Denver as part of the exhibition. And I know you took care in terms of what Three Deuces would play. So during the run of the exhibition, every 15 minutes, there's the Steinway Stereo B plays a selection of songs. And then once a month, Three Deuces was activated by different musicians, all of them Denver-based, or I should say Colorado-based. Let's talk about that. What does it mean to make an exhibition tailored a bit for a place? And I'm also fascinated with how you've described Denver music. I think on Friday you talked about the very open-hearted way that Ron Miles plays his cornet. And, you know, when you were asked to work in Denver, what did that mean to you?
Well, I think, I think every city kind of has a character, and the musicians that are raised in that city also build upon that character that they inherit. And I'm from Houston, but I moved to New York when I was 18, and I've lived the rest of my life here in New York City. And so I bring a Houston sound to New York, or when I would meet musicians from Denver, there was also a kind of like a sound in that, so meeting Ron Miles, meeting Bill Frisell, meeting Otis Taylor, it just was something that you could characterize. Rudy Royston, Tia Fuller, like as a sound from the place. And that led me to more understand, okay, that's what we also are enamored by when we hear kind of Miles Davis, or we hear Charlie Parker, or we hear Billie Holiday. We are also hear where they're from. And they transmit that to the world. And so to have the Three Deuces there, and then also have these moments where other musicians came in to play on it, which is a weird thing to do. It's not like a concert. It's a different kind of offering. And, I thought it was another way to kind of also have the city have another place to recognize the music in the city. And I think any cultural space has the opportunity to do that. A museum has the opportunity to showcase sound. A club has the opportunity to showcase photography, to really change up who's doing what, because we really do need each institution to be really wide in how they understand the craft that they exhibit. And so that was thrilled to have the musicians kind of come charge up that space.
Yeah, I was struck how different it was every iteration. I mean, Otis Taylor versus Derek Hodges on the bass versus Pernell Steen's Cool Yule concert, which, the Christmas carols maybe were not as experimental as the other examples, but to me it felt absolutely appropriate because Pernell is the voice of 5 points.
Right.
He's giving you this sound of 5 points, right?
The other thing that when I came to Denver early on with you to just have a site visit and visit with other musicians that lived in the city was Ron, and meeting kind of the historians, the official and the unofficial historians in the city who know the city's history, and the musicians and the club owners and the artists who kind of helped kind of like make sure that history stayed present. I mean, the thing we're also watching is, anytime you watch a jazz club die, it's not simply the jazz club that dies or is torn down or closed. There's an entire kind of like, there's an entire garden of culture that also gets depleted with that moment. And we have to be very careful about when that happens, because then there becomes a mode of erasure that we say is okay to do. And it's not simply happening in Denver, it's happening in San Francisco, it's happening in LA, it's happening here in New York, in Chicago, in Philly, in DC, all of these places where this music, though it's not, I'm speaking specifically of jazz, though it's not the most popular sound that people want to explore, but it does offer us a unique viewpoint on where we are as a culture. And because it's also one of our treasures of American art forms too. It's only birthed here, and it continues to show us our flaws. So when we tear that thing down, that means we're kind of getting rid of textbooks. Fortunately, the fate of the music also lies in the youth, and the youth are like, whatever, we're going to build a new space. And that kind of cycle, I'm fortunate to continue to have faith in that continues to happen too.
Yeah, I love the metaphor of the garden, because gardens support myriad life forms, and even life forms that you're not seeing or noticing right away. Like you're not noticing the beetles under the soil, but they're part of it too. And so it feels appropriate. So speaking of spaces that are in transition or had past lives, I'm showing you now the Rossonian. So this is a photo I took of our visit to the Rossonian, which is at the intersection, the 5-point intersection of 5 points. So the namesake intersection of 5 points. And in its heyday, which essentially was from the 1920s to the 1950s, this was the nexus of jazz history in Denver. This was the place where the jazz luminaries that traveled, say, coming from St. Louis or Chicago, they passed through the Rossonian Hotel, performed in the lounge, and then continued on their way to the West Coast. And embedded in that story, those stories of greatness, is of course stories of systemic racism. One of the reasons that many Black musicians stayed here is because they were not allowed to stay downtown, and there were housing covenants restricting where people could move. So as part of your site visit, we went here to the Rossonian, and there was a very special moment, actually, during the visit that I thought sort of sealed. I thought in a way I felt like it sealed your fate with us. I was like, okay, now.
it's real. Yeah. Yeah. We walked in they had a little spinet piano. I mean, there's a couple of things to note about it. And one is that the space is still there, right? That's, regardless of everything else, that space is still there. In New York City, they demolished the Lenox Lounge, which had been on 125th Street and Lenox Avenue for almost 75 years. And not only did they demolish it, they did a root canal in Harlem, and they dug underneath the ground and just they went like 2 stories deep and just dug it all the way up. And then they put a Wells Fargo bank there. And I was depleted by that. But the Rossonian, that space is still there. Still has the lettering on the outside, the sign on the outside, still has. So, when we walked in and there was this upright sitting there, a spinet, I said, well, can I have a moment to send some sound into the room? And sitting down to play a song that James B. Johnson, a great Harlem stride pianist, played called Carolina Shout. Because of what I understood about Denver and began to learn was its place in not only the Great Migration, but its place in how the Pullman porters shared the news, right? How we understood the progress or the terror that might be approaching, those stories that were shared. And so the musicians also are aware of this too when they arrive in these cities. And I think that one of the things that Black music does is it tells us where are the safe spaces. So do we talk about the city? Do we talk about a street corner? Do we talk about the slang they use on this side of town? Nat King Cole singing Route 66 is not simply about a highway, it's about a highway out. And it's understanding that. So Denver was called the Harlem of the West because of all the music that it attracted, because of the great Black music it attracted. And it was a sign and a place for people to know that was safe too, to come find if you found the music, you found the safety. And in all those choruses of music that Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, all of them played, for all of the entertainment it brought, it also brought a cloak of safety that the people in that room could experience together. And not all rooms exhibit that, but the Rossonian, that it's there, it still holds that memory,
Yeah. And then while we were there, so you played this incredible concert to the gods, as you described it. And while we were there, you took a photograph of this fragment of original wallpaper, really the only remaining fragment in the space. It was like this tiny snippet of what the walls held in decades past. And I think this provokes an interesting question as far as when you're recreating a space. So even Three Deuces, and there's the padded walls, there's certain elements you call out, right? Because you can't create the entire composite of what it was. But can you talk a bit about this process of, holding details?
Yeah, well, I guess, a room is like a song too, a different decorator might come in and say, okay, let's get rid of all that lighting, Nakashima might say, okay, let's get rid of all those metal tables. We only want wood tables, and I think about the designers who were like placing, tables and picking out wallpaper or the kind of, suede they want for the seating. Those are all also acoustic elements too that help soak up the sound or give the audience a sense of warmth, especially in cold Denver. And so, I spent one summer in Rome at the American Academy about 4-5 years ago. And that was kind of eye-opening to go through the catacombs to see the traces of the painting on the wall, to really see like, how does something stay, or how is it refreshed, once it's located. And so, of course, walking into the Rossonian and seeing that snatch of wallpaper, I was like, it shouts out as something to pull forward, because also it reminded me of the wallpaper or the kind of paper that was the decoration that was behind the Savoy Ballroom, which was a very famous jazz club in Harlem in the 1920s. It's also floral, so these things about or metaphors about plant life in the spaces where improvisational music lives, I guess Stevie Wonder says it best with The Secret Life of Plants, it does kind of give us a sense of understanding about where we are, and what kind of music happens in a space that has this kind of wallpaper,
Yeah, it's so distinctive. I have to say, people who have seen it since have asked, like, how can I get that wallpaper?
It's good. It's good wallpaper. It's good wallpaper. Yeah.
Yeah. So your layers of research went even further within Denver, in addition to seeing these historic spaces in 5 Points. You went to the Blair Caldwell African American Research Library. And in this photograph, you're seeing Terry Nelson, the head archivist and, premier expert regarding 5 Points history, as well as Florence Blackwell, the MCA's curatorial intern who supported the process of your research. And you looked at quite a lot of photographs and quite a lot of material. And did you go in looking for anything specific, or was it completely open?
It's always open entering an archive. I love entering archives. I say that I also have my own archive myself, and it's just following my nose, wherever the research is. Then, every once in a while, check a museum and also check eBay. You never know. You never know where this stuff is. But coming to the Blair Caldwell was important because it was the place where collections landed, and collections based in Black community land. And it's really important to know that there is a place that says, oh, my grandmother passed, here is her entire library, or here is her entire social diary, to map kind of where the community is, where it was, and where it can go. And so meeting Terry and walking through the boxes and having the conversation that would lead to, oh, do you know this musician? Watch this documentary, or have you seen this photograph? Or, not only the archive that lives online, but then to walk into the stacks and see how it's all taken care of, and when a new collection is coming in, seeing kind of in her eyes the excitement of when a collection is coming in, of what she can see as well. And I'd say that I'm also, through music making, I'm also an archivist in that way, always looking through the trove of songs to try to find something too. So it's not simply looking for the object, it's kind of also thinking about the song that also goes alongside that object. And we found some beautiful photographs taken in Denver that really, I think, kind of ask those questions about where the music is, who's keeping the music alive, what the venues look like and feel like. And I think they really charge the conversation between the works on paper that I made, but also the history of where the music was happening and that kind of residue that was in those photographs.
Yeah, so I'm showing I have an image pulled up from one of the photos you selected, and this was so what we're seeing here is Leroy Smith's Rhythm Record and Sporting Goods, and the gentleman on the far left is Leroy Smith, and Leroy Smith Jr. is the young man next to him who actually came and saw the exhibition.
So great.
And so this was a prominent business in 5 Points. Leroy Smith was the first Black member of Denver's Chamber of Commerce, well-known musician, operated a music venue of his own. But, what's so striking, what you can't miss about this photograph is the fact that you're able to buy records and rifles in the same space.
Right. I mean, yeah, I couldn't get over that kind of safety. that when I talk about the cloak of safety, or the cloak of the intimacy that one needs to feel when they listen to music, and the kind of surroundings they have, whether it's the furniture or the wallpaper or the music itself or the drink you're having. But when you go home, what do you take with you? What is the things that protect you? there could be photographs of friends from back home somewhere, but there also could be this record, and there also could be this gun. And I'll bring up that part about having those two side by side, because Leroy is on. I've never seen a record store and a rifle store at all. But also Leroy is the person that people would find when they were coming, when Muhammad Ali is coming to town. He finds Leroy Smith to say, "Oh, let's go on the radio." Like, Leroy is trying to take care of people. He's giving them tools for survival. And somehow this image, my goodness, it's about this large, but we really blow it up to see the details of the space, because that's the kind of complexity that is in the neighborhood. It's the kind of, these are the tools for survival,
Yeah, I think something I found very striking, and now I'm showing an image of from the Escalites drill teams, essentially a social dance. And so these are teenage saxophonists and band players accompanying the young women of the Escalites drill team, which was essentially, a young ladies finishing school in the heart of 5 Points. And I found it striking that, you could have gone for the quintessential headshot of Duke Ellington, or, Ella Fitzgerald performing in the Rossonian with the microphone, etc. And I found it fascinating that you gravitated towards these scenes of everyday life, really. These musicians who weren't anywhere as famous as Duke Ellington. So we're looking at photographs by Bernice McLeod, who documented extensively life in 5 Points, from everywhere from the Rossonian to different, social clubs.
Yeah, like seeing McLeod's images, like I think of, let's say, James Van Der Zee in Harlem, or I think of, Teenie Harris in Pittsburgh, like they document it all. And McLeod's archive is immense. But also what I see in this image here is I see me because I was one of these kids who played, these events for my aunts who were in the AKAs or the Girlfriends or the Links, like I've been the musician at these events, kind of like just, happy to have a gig to get some money. So here, and it's important to think about, like, what are the greater communities that keep the music alive? And social clubs for Black women and men were really important, because they don't necessarily seek the publicity in the press, but that work is done kind of underground. And as glorious as this image looks too, these striking men with their sunglasses staring forward, and also the sisters on the right, at the table. And that is kind of how I think the music lives in a community. That's why it has sustaining power. is because it doesn't simply regard itself as a commercial act. It really is sunk inside and molded and melted with the community. That's what keeps it alive. But you won't see this image in, a downbeat jazz magazine, but for me, it's important because I know what that feels like as a kid growing up in Houston. Once I got serious about music and playing these events for Black social groups in Houston. And so there's something about having that document. So seeing McLeod's image of this moment is very rare, but also really striking, because also these kids look like they're in the Black Panther Party too. They're ready for it,
Yeah, yeah. And so this image actually featured quite prominently in the exhibition. So here is how Leroy Smith's rhythm records and sporting goods appeared in the exhibition, enlarged at the scale at which you could actually walk right up to the figures in the photograph and have them feel more or less, not quite life-size, but not far from it, directly in dialogue with the works. But we also had an image of the Escalites drill team directly in juxtaposition to the works on paper, so that the history was part of the space. So it was the new work, but also commemorating these spaces and places and 5 points in the same room as Three Deuces. So, we had New York, we had Denver, sort of combined and mixed in the room. And then here, the works on paper were hung, in some cases in salon style. And so this would have been sort of placed between Three Deuces and the large scale photograph of the Escalites drill team. And this is actually one of my favorite walls in the show, because you can see the evolution of your works on paper practice to some extent. So on the right, we have the space between where you were working in black charcoal, and you can see there's sort of a more clear distinction of the placement of the hands rather than the entire keyboard. Then we have works on paper where you've really worked over the keyboard, sort of in this thick sort of accumulation of pigment. And then we have We Are Songs in the Room, where there's sort of this repetition of lines and space. So can you talk a bit about how your own approach to these works on paper evolved with time?
I mean, I'd say it's like writing a piece of music. Once you have a blank sheet of manuscript paper sitting in front of me at the piano, then it just asks questions about how will you, how will you start? And what you see on the right and on the left of this image is kind of how I'm starting. How I'm understanding like paper, as a medium rather than sound. And it's a very big jump or leap for me, because I also think of as the composition, as that's Thelonious Monk or many other people have said, less is more. But also the way I play, sometimes I look for the maximum too. So over time, then I started to try to see, well, what if the paper held more? How much can it hold? Can I reach the edge, of the paper too? And so these, you're starting to see the work kind of like go further out, have longer times that it sits on the keys, before I pull it away and say it's done. So it is a practice of also just getting, like with anything, kind of getting up my own muscle memory for making work too, sits on the paper.
And it's a very specific paper, right? It's always Gampi paper, which you've said you love the very specific qualities of.
Yeah, this Japanese Gampi paper, handmade in these small villages, it at once is really durable, but also really fragile. So it can take all of the attack of my hand and not necessarily just rip to shreds. But it's also soft enough to receive and record every touch. I mean, it's like, so it's very thin. You could say it's almost like the Shroud of Turin. Like it kind of like allows for all of that to live on its surface without totally just, like withering away. So that's why I like it. Something about both its durability and its fragility at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. And if we could look at that image again, it also shows, how you really started to work with blue as a medium, the color.
Mm-hmm.
And the room
Mm-hmm.
is called Bathing the Room, or I'm sorry, the exhibition is called Bathing the Room with Blues.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this, layered symbolic significance to blues, right?
Mm-hmm. Of course, I mean, I rack my brain trying to think about any other music that is called, the genre that is called a color. And the blues is the backbone of all American music. It just is. For all of its virtues and its sins that the blues documents, from Robert Johnson to the field hollers of enslaved peoples for centuries. To Bessie Smith, all the way up to Ruthie Foster today. So the blues is a it also is the residue of of America's problems. And as a color is also was something that I couldn't get enough of, because at the same time that I was also recognizing my own relationship to the blues as a Texan, teaching the history of jazz and blues at a school in Boston, but also trying to think about this color that in many cultures around the world holds a power. And so how did these musicians also then bring these sounds to these humble spaces, whether it was on the porch of a juke joint in Alabama, to a club in New Orleans, up to Chicago, to the recording studio. How did they say that this music was worth bringing all these places? Well, because it charted a territory and it charted an emotion that was yet uncharted. And that was something that people needed to feel. And so the exhibition is also about how sound does that to a room, as well as these works, but really how sound bathes a room.
Yeah, and I just have to add that the color of the room coincidentally is blue note. That was not planned, but it felt poetically significant to create this space for listening and looking. So we see how the wallpaper of the Rossonian was reproduced as part of the exhibition in a sort of a wraparound effect. So you felt surrounded by it. But we also wanted to honor the fact that it was just a fragment in the Rossonian, right? Not the entire wall. So it stops to sort of acknowledge that absence. And on these walls here, we have blue calaminthia on the right, Barley and Hopkins in the center, and these blues for Norman Lewis on the left.
Blues for Norman Lewis. I mean, I got to say, a lot of this work that I'm making is also all in tribute to Norman Lewis, who I consider my favorite artist. And actually, after I finish this call today, I'm going to go to Bill Hodges' gallery to see these paintings I've never seen before in person of Norman Lewis, because there's one. I mean, and the piece in the middle is also for Lightning Hopkins, a Houstonian blues musician. So that H is for Hopkins. But I think as also, as a musician, it's also really important to kind of chart where you are or which star you're pointing towards. And Norman Lewis and Lightning Hopkins are really important parts of my musical and artistic DNA. So this is also a space to honor their paths.
Yeah, and the Norman Lewis piece, probably more than any other artwork in the show, has this all over effect, right? Every inch of the paper has been worked over. And could you say a bit more about what attracts you to Norman Lewis's approach to abstraction?
Well, Norman Lewis, I mean, one part is he listens to the music all the time. And so he's always talking about his relationship to jazz. And you see it in the work, how he follows the line, the way his work looks in the 40s versus how it changed in the 50s. And then the kind of activism it took in the 60s, with works he made about, the KKK or about the marches, he was very deliberate in this. And I think the way he thinks of abstraction because he doesn't think of it as abstract. He thinks it is just a very much a part of who he is, and also a part of understanding his community that he lives in. And the work feels like that. And I think for us musicians who improvise most of our lives, we also think of abstraction that way. So much so that the term abstraction is rarely used in jazz school. I don't think that's great. I think we really should think about abstraction as a tool. And Norman Lewis, for me, has been the great example of pulling me into an understanding of the relationship between music and images, and something about the mist he can create on paper. He is the goal. And so that piece for him really does try to reach to the edge. It was an effort I tried to take to reach to the edge, because I think, Lewis does this effortlessly with such grace and such specificity to each small ink mark, that he does, to these bursts that look like, like a flock of birds. He's just a phenomenal artist.
Yeah, I agree with you. That specificity is, yes, very much his and what makes his work. So the next image I have is actually of taken right after one of the first activations of Three Deuces. And so we have Otis Taylor and Ron Miles and yourself. You had just performed a trio for Three Deuces. And so in a way, it's capturing a moment, right? And a gathering of Colorado voices. And you acknowledged in the performance, Otis Taylor was a pivotal factor in you coming to love Colorado.
Yes. Yeah. Otis, I met Otis maybe in like either West Virginia or somewhere. I can't even remember, but Otis he met the band. He's like, "Oh yeah, y'all should come out here. We should make a record together." So Otis was open, and then he brought us in, and then he has this very also historical approach to understanding what the blues and what bluegrass means to America, and especially to Black music. And on this record, Ron Miles was on this record too. It's one of the first times I met Ron was working with Otis Taylor. So to kind of jumpstart the exhibition with this moment where Otis and Ron and I get to play together again, and for the only time as a trio in this space, felt really right, because I felt like those two really do hold and cherish the relationship Colorado has to the world, and they have documented a large part of the sound that I understand as specifically Colorado.
Yeah. And so just a few more artworks to talk about, only because I feel like these artworks exemplify what we've been what you've been describing in terms of getting looser with the works and freer with the works, and getting, you said you really had to stretch yourself to use the whole paper. And this one, I believe, is These Storms Are Ancestral, and which is such an evocative title. So do you feel like this is an indicator of where the work is going for you, or are you pulling it in different directions?
It depends on the weather outside. But yeah, I'd say that when I have goals that I think all art making can be about goals, but it really is in the pursuit of it. And then we chart that pursuit, whether we actually reach that point or not. These paper works are much larger than the keyboard. So there's a kind of, exaggerating the gesture to get to use this much of the paper. And that for me is intriguing. It's difficult because now it has to become much more active than me just simply sitting and kind of playing at the keys itself, but it's really having now a physical relationship with how I move the paper, how I let the pigment kind of dive over the paper or chart the cracks in the folds. And that is, that's still a process that is ongoing. And yeah, I just ordered more paper just to get back into it for this winter and spring, because I feel like that is, well, we'll see what happens. Let's say that.
Exciting. And this is yet another, also called These Storms Are Ancestral. The previous one was These Storms Are Ancestral #5. This is #6. And this one, to me, reminds me of smoke in the room, right? That's sort of really getting into that ambient feeling you were talking about, of how do we capture a sense of place and moments, pushing the abstraction further, right?
Right. And this also, these were made during a time, there's something that happens in the summers, like growing up in Texas or getting into the fall, then you knew there was hurricane season. And there was a relationship with understanding when the sky changed, and watching it. I remember my grandmother standing on her porch and pointing at this line of clouds and said, "You see that? That's the front coming in." Like pointing like that's the specific moment that the front is coming, like, so watching the sky as generations and of people have done is watch the sky to look for the sign. And I also think that these pieces are also about the storms that happen annually that come off of the west coast of Africa and come across the Middle Passage, the Atlantic Ocean, and I think churn up spirits that are buried in that ocean, and they bring them to the shores of South Carolina, of Virginia, of Georgia, of Florida, of the Caribbean. They chart that same path that the Middle Passage, for millions of Africans who were robbed from their homeland. And these storms bring a bit of terror, but that's ancestral. It's not simply, oh, this is a weather occurrence, but that's, this earth is baking some of these stories for us. So the pieces also kind of are looking for a way to document that kind of sound too,
Yeah, I've lived in Houston, and I can attest that the air feels like a physical thing when you're there.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Especially in summer. And there's that deep history, obviously, with Galveston, and deep history of being a port for slaves, and definitely. And I want to acknowledge that one of the highlights of the show is also your branching into different colored paper. So on the lower level of the exhibition, there's a row of works set against this sort of very vibrant pink red sort of paper where the blue pops out against it.
Yeah, it's I think there's something that I'm still figuring out as well, but there's something about when you send it all through a different lens, so it's kind of like switching from piano to electronic keyboard, what kind of sounds become possible, how does it radiate, and so yes, it's still the question I ask, or it's kind of like hiring a different musician who all of a sudden brings an entire different layer that your music didn't have before that invitation happened. And so I look for that interaction too. So that's what we're kind of also seeing.
Yeah. And then to me, the crescendo of the lower level is staged groundwork, where I feel like all the things you've been talking about regarding the physicality of music and music production comes home to bear in this work, because this is the actual drop cloth underneath the piano when the works were made. So to me, it really lands that this is where the music was made in the moment it was made. So that rectangle you can see on the left is the footprint of the actual piano, right?
Yeah, that's where the keyboard sat for months and months and months. And I would just wrap it up in the cloth and put a tarp on top of it. And then I'd come back out, some days or weeks later and unpack it again. And it became the only place, was my only stage, because there were no performances happening early in the pandemic. And so I really spent a lot of time right there. And then also simultaneously writing a lot of music too. I would go back into the house and then go to the piano and write too, which became another record called The Sound Will Tell You. And so it was something about, and then by the end, preparing for the exhibition at Luring Augustine, then when I was kind of like packing things up and looked at this was the mark. This was the space. This is as important for a moment in time as I feel like understanding the Three Deuces is, where was a musician when they couldn't go anywhere? And that's kind of where I was. It was the stage that I could play on.
Yeah, and that pigment is very physical unto itself, right? We've talked about air and ambiance, like that pigment. I mean, I remember when we installed the piece, we were like essentially covered head to toe in it. I mean, it's just.
Sorry. Yeah. It has its own life. It has its own life. But also I think that's also what draws me to it, rather than I haven't quite share publicly what I think a paintbrush can do. But I think that the pigment is alive, and so it lives and it falls where it wants to fall.
Yeah. And so this is, I should say, pretty monumental in scale. It essentially goes almost floor to ceiling in the space, as a trace and as a space. And I like how the folds in the way become their own lines and their own traces. I want to acknowledge that right next to stage Groundwork, there's an incredible 3-screen video piece by Lorna Simpson called Chess from 2013. And we talked a lot about what would accompany the works on paper in this exhibition. I remember you said, let's make it one of the collaborative works, one of the collaborative video pieces, and acknowledging that we have Deborah Roberts' collages on the second floor above your show. You described wanting to be surrounded by powerful, strong Black women, right, as part of the project. And so there's Lorna Simpson on the lower level, and this collaborative work. And you're on the third screen there.
Right. Yeah, it's a piece, she developed, 2013, it seems like yesterday, but in this piece where she's playing this chess game against herself, one dressed as a man and another as a woman, playing the same game. And she asked for a sound that was about a mirror. And it made me think specifically of these gorgeous pieces that Brahms, the composer Johannes Brahms, wrote piano exercises. And one of them has this kind of mirror motion where the hands move opposition to each other, kind of like how I was talking about in the beginning, and towards each other. So they fall away, they come into each other. They fall away, they come into each other. There was something about that temptation as I was trying to play the piece on that third screen, that then it starts to erupt and have its own life, and it falls away into a very abstract moment to then more an elegy at the end, all while she is patiently playing this game against herself and also aging in the process too. And so it, for me, it's also a powerful work, but it rarely also gets seen in America. But I thought Chess would be a great addition because of its pacing. And it's a piece that you sit down, and I guess it's maybe 8 minutes, 9 minutes, not that long. So you really can watch it numerous times and kind of get lost in the pacing of Lorna's piece.
Yeah, it really, because the figures age, it provokes a lot of existential questions, right? About, what is life about, and how do you win against yourself or lose against yourself? And in the end, it's, about this internal battle. I liked it as a compliment to the show too, because Lorna Simpson based her representations of these individuals off photos she found in a photo booth. So I love that it's like yet another interpretation of daily Black life as part of the exhibition.
Yeah, they all, and Deborah's a fantastic show too. Someone has to be kind of capturing the moment. It's almost like our work doesn't exist without someone else doing that before us, and then we're able to kind of like churn it into something new, but it really does need that moment of like kind of like a relay race, where someone passes you the baton, say. And that, I love artists who work that way.
Yeah. So the last thing I wanted to touch on was just acknowledging these moments of magic, these activations. So this is a photograph of, Otis Taylor singing about the history of the banjo. You're playing, Ron Miles is accompanying on cornet. And so, the show is always alive. And yet these moments like these feel like where the life takes another, is elevated to another level, right? There's that actual sound in the room.
I like to tell everybody, the banjo came from Africa. It did not come from Appalachia. It came over in the slave ships. The slaves played for Thomas Jefferson. They played the minstrel shows. played the blues.
Can you talk a bit about this moment?
Well, making music is finding something in the moment. And it's, since the work is time based, you can't predict the future. And if you're playing with great musicians, you don't want to. You want to experience it as it arrives. And when it does, it just charges everything around it, because everybody's discovering it at the same moment. Nobody can say, oh, I know what's going to happen 2 minutes from now. Now you really we're all riding it together. And that's something you generate not only for each other on the bandstand, but you do it for your audience, so that they feel that undescribable feeling of discovery, to be reminded of it too. And to be reminded of it, especially when the time during a pandemic where we may have taken for granted the moment of gathering in a room and playing, even like last week being at the Holiday Theater and playing with the band, there were moments where we were playing. I thought there were so many frequencies flying off the wall at such a high frequency range that I could swear I heard other voices. I didn't talk about it to the audience, but every time I would play like a bunch of notes at the top, I was like, that's not just me. That's something else kind of coming out of the walls. And music allows kind of spaces to speak. It sends sounds through the walls, into the walls, to ricochet and then make something special. If it's good. And so that playing in the gallery also felt like that. I brought the band by on Friday just for a short walkthrough, and we just couldn't resist the temptation of jumping into the Three Deuces for 10 minutes and playing some music.
To the delight of everyone there. Yeah, so I want to send folks home with an excerpt of your performance in the Holiday. It should be acknowledged that the Holiday Theater is a new endeavor for MCA. We just signed a 10-year lease. It's a historic space. And so, it had those bizarre Egyptian murals that you saw on the walls, acknowledge that it was built during the heyday of the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb, and the excitement that was generated around that. And so to me, it felt, given your passion for acknowledging the history of spaces, it felt poetic that this space is now coming to life once more in a new iteration with your music, and with the bandwagon, who you said you play. Yeah, and you've been playing together now 22 years.
Yeah, that was special. And then and Sarah noted that we hadn't been to Denver. We hadn't played there in quite a while, in about 8 years or 9 years. So it felt good to be kind of back in the city as a band again. And also eat at that amazing taqueria right next door too.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm thinking about those enchiladas. But it was great to be on the stage with the group, and in front of an audience too, because I knew people braved, maybe, even defying their partners at home, saying, don't go out, and coming out to hear music. So I hope everyone did and felt safe, and got home safe and continues to be safe, because it is a time to you ask yourself, well, what is it worth, And for us traveling musicians, it continues to be worth it to try to get some music out, because it's not simply for us.
Yeah, well, there's a joy that came through, absolutely, and some laughter too, which was really nice. But Jason, thank you so much for so many things, but above all, for the love and energy you've given to Denver. It's deeply felt, and we feel so grateful to have worked with you.
Oh, thank you.